Welcome, everybody, to Freelance Writing Direct. I'm your host, Estelle Erasmus, the author of Writing That Gets Noticed, Find Your Voice, Become a Better Storyteller, Get Published, and it is now a course at NYU and an elective towards the journalism certificate. Every week, I speak with novelists, with authors, with writers of every niche to talk about their tips, their tricks, their strategies, and how the sauce is made, including creative advice. I'll talk about essays and articles and share my own experience from 3 decades of publishing. So join me every week and grow your business and build your craft with Freelance Writing Direct. And don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review on iTunes, and follow along on Substack, where I share special clips for subscribers only at estelleserasmus.substack.com. Welcome, everybody, to this episode of Freelance Writing Direct. I'm your host, Estelle Erasmus, the author of Writing That Gets Noticed, which is now one of the best books for writers named by Poets and Writers magazines. And I'm so happy to have Ruth Bonapace with us today. Ruth is the author of the hot new novel, The Bulgarian Training Manual. And I want to tell you a little bit about Ruth, and then I'll tell you how we are connected. So Ruth earned her MFA from Stony Brook University after a career in journalism, including 2 years covering professional sports for the Associated Press. Her work has appeared in many publications, including the New York Times, Newsday, the Southampton Review, Hippocampus, and the Saturday Evening Post. She is a 2-time finalist in the annual American Writers Review. The Bulgarian Training Manual is her first novel, and Ruth has gotten accolades from Publishers Weekly, from Elle Magazine, from Kirkus as well. So it's just so wonderful. And I was honored that Ruth had asked me to interview her for an appearance at, what is the bookstore called in Hoboken?
Little City Books in Hoboken.
Shout out to Little City Books, a lovely place. And so I interviewed her. But going back a little further, Ruth and I reconnected, of all places, at the Irma Bombeck Writers Workshop this year. And what happened was I was teaching a session on micro-memoir, and I was waiting at the end of the session to get ready to go to the bus. And I thought, oh no, people were talking, and I thought, I'm gonna miss the bus. And I had something scheduled back at the hotel. And then Ruth came up to me and she said, hi, I just want to say that I really enjoyed your session. I said, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And we talked, and I don't know how it happened, but she said, I used to work in magazines, and I know you did. And I said, where did you work? And then she said, I worked for Bauer Publishing. And I said, well, what publication? And then she said, First for Women. I said, wait, I think I know you. And I said my maiden name when I was working, that was decades ago in the 90s. And I said Estelle Erasmus now, but Estelle Sobel then. And she said, I do know you.
Yes.
Not only did we know each other, but we're neighbors. So it was amazing that we made this connection. And I was so glad that she came up to me. And I'm so glad that we've since had lunch and stayed connected. And I'm even more thrilled when I read her book and I knew that I wanted to have her on the program. So that's a little bit of the backstory. Now, Ruth, why don't you tell everybody what the Bulgarian Training Manual is and the genesis of that idea?
Well, the origins of it, it's not a manual that you follow. This is purely fiction. It's a wild ride. And many years ago, there was a guy at my gym and I was trying hard and I was working out, and he gave me these photocopied pages. And he said, here, this is like really special. You know, don't tell anybody I gave it to you, but it's like it's what the Bulgarians use, and it's been compiled to, they're weightlifters and everything. And it turns out it was really like a how-to guide for powerlifters, Olympic powerlifters, which meant clearly, like as I read it, it was so complicated, so wild, the things that they did. It was like, what? Can anybody do this? Certainly not me. But so it was no way. But I kept it because I thought it was so interesting. And then I started researching it a little bit, like, where did this come from? And it's basically taken from this famous Bulgarian powerlifting coach. And a lot of people in that field want to know, well, how did he train his people? Like, what gave them the edge, which is not unusual, but it was actually, it's been like bootlegged and everything. So anyway, I always kept that in the back of my mind. And then years later, when I was going for my MFA, I went back to school. I was actually going to write, I was thinking of writing a novel. I was going to write a different novel, but I wrote this piece like right at near the beginning. It was a short story and it brought in this manual, the Bulgarian Training Manual. And I read it at, there was like a conference, a summer conference, and they asked me to read, and I read that. And afterward, people came up to me and they said, well, what happens next? Like, what happens with this manual? What does she do with it? I'm like, I don't know. And that became eventually the first chapter of my book, and Meg Wolitzer, also the novelist, I had taken a workshop with her at the same place. And she also said, she sat down with me at the end. She goes, well, is this part of a novel? And I'm like, no, it's just like 20 pages. And then, so anyway, long story short, I thought from time to time, I'd sit there and I keep writing it, rewriting it. And eventually, like 300 pages later, it was a book, and I'm glad I pursued it because it was just one of those things. It was this like twirling in my head, but then still somebody said, this is interesting. Why don't you do more? And then I started thinking, maybe it is,
That's fascinating. And it's such a wild ride of a book, if I could say, because it takes so many twists and turns and brings in pop culture and so many elements from, like from Rachel Ray to diet culture to biblical references. It just is an amalgam of so much, which is just like kind of food for the brain. And I know that at some point you were asked to describe your book in 6 words. Can you say what you called it at that time?
Oh, yeah. It was Barbie on steroids was one, and the other one was Chick Lit on acid. I think that was the other
I
one.
love that because it really makes so much sense. And the protagonist is a Jersey girl, which I love. And it's kind of like a shout out to places in New Jersey as well as this, wild ride through other countries. And of course, ending up in Bulgaria and having all that happen. Tell me about you and how there's any kind of confluence with the protagonist. For example, Tina. So Tina is into working out, and I know you're into working out. Like, are there other connections between the two of you?
Well, there are. It's like everything in life counts. And what I wanted to do is, besides the pop, I definitely wanted to put in societal and pop culture references for sure. I didn't want it to be, oh, this is haha funny on the surface. I wanted it to really be like the way we think, and not to get off track, but it's like if I'm thinking like shoulda, woulda, coulda, I should have done this, I could have done that. That's stuff that we all do. And Tina does it to the max. And so, so I've worked but a lot of it's based on real life, as crazy as it may seem, because I actually worked as a realtor for a while. When it's in between like some magazine jobs and everything, I got my real estate license. I actually renovated a couple of properties along the way in my life. So I've gotten to know that world of real estate really well. And I also, I ran a laundromat for a year. That was like a weird thing, but there were people who were exactly like, there's some of the characters in my book were spitting images of the people that I had encountered and I talked to on a day-to-day basis. I wasn't at the laundromat every day, but I was like in charge, like when things went wrong. So I'd be running down there and the gym, my experience at the gym, people I've met, the types, personality types. In fact, the guy who gave me this bootleg manual, he was a competitive bodybuilder, like an amateur, but a bunch of us from the gym went to see him at a contest. And he would tell us about his training and his diet and everything else. And so we were like his rooting section from home, I think they say, write what you know, because even if what you know seems boring, it isn't. Just mind it, think about it, expand it, because what you know is powerful.
I was thinking about that exact phrase when you were talking, like, write what you know. And it's interesting because when I first started interviewing novelists for the podcast, I thought, oh, no, it's all created in your head. But really, the strongest characters are infused with life experiences by the authors. That's what I found with talking to novelist Amanda Churchill and talking to novelist Anne Hood, and and memoirist. But I think that
Yeah,
it
Anne Hood
really
wrote about being a flight attendant.
well, that was her memoir, but
Yeah.
her book, The Stolen Child, which was a recent episode, that incorporated her travels in Italy and her passions for collecting certain types of sculptures. And so it's just really fascinating to me. And I think it makes a novel come alive when it's imbued with that gem of reality, even though it's fictional. So this is something new that I learned. Maybe people know that already, but I found it really interesting. So I want to ask you, you take us on a wild ride with this book. It covers everything from religion to scams to different forms of romance to ancestral history, genealogy, magic, real estate, as you mentioned. Were there any books that influenced you in this form of genre and this form of writing? Such a complicated story that has so many different elements, but is also very entertaining.
Yeah, I would say one book that one author's real influence was Mark Lehner. And Mark is also from Hoboken, where part of my book takes place. And his books were quite successful, and they bend genres. He'll throw in playwriting, he'll throw in screenwriting, he'll throw in all sorts of things. And I actually know him, and I just love that you can just go wild. One of his books, My Cousin, My Gastroenterologist, is really experimental. I read it when it first came out, and it says something like, I was an intense dot, and my parents were huge and lurid puppets, and it goes on from there. And I was like, whoa. And then he had wrote like a bunch of others. Et tu, Babe, which is a lampoon of the film industry, because he had been invited to like get optioned for a screenplay and what he found in Hollywood. So he wrote, but all of them, he takes people from his lives, like his life, his parents, his wife, his daughter, his friends, and sometimes like kind of incorporates them and fictional characters, of course, in the wildest way. But it has a very definite male sensibility, in my opinion. I've always read it, and sometimes I feel like I don't really like relate to that. And not surprisingly, he had a column eventually in Esquire. It's definitely like a male type of book. And so when I was writing mine, he actually said, he goes, just write your book. Don't worry about, will this fit? Is this right? Can I do this? He said, you can do whatever you want and see what happens. Like, we were having a drink one night, and we were talking about my book when it was kind of about halfway done. And then that was really valuable. It's very freeing having somebody giving permission, so to speak. And then also seeing that it can be done, and he does it differently than me. But he actually wrote a blurb in the beginning of my book, and I was a little nervous because it was like, there's the finished product. You told me to do this. But that I would say his writing influenced me.
That's wonderful. And I'm going to have to look up his writing. So when you imbue magic into your book, like, is that something that you're interested in or that you have experience in? I love books that incorporate magic. I've been working on and off for a number of years on a novel that involves magic. And so I love the elements of magic that you incorporated into the book seamlessly. So what are your feelings about that, and how did you decide to go about it?
Well, I think I've always been interested in fairy tales, and that probably comes through like after the fact if you read the book. And there's this witch Baba Yaga, which is an Eastern European type of legendary witch who could be good and could be bad, which is what I found was interesting. Even though she looked really ugly in like drawings of her, she's also protected people. But you never know, she could turn against you. So I like that idea of ambiguity, and as opposed to good versus evil. And I was writing a scene in the middle of the book where they actually go to Bulgaria, and I didn't want it to be conventional. I was trying out different things, and suddenly I had this idea of just this kind of wild, like a parade, because in Hoboken they used to fill up the balloons for the Macy's Thanksgiving parade. And I had this image: if you took the Macy's Thanksgiving parade out of like Fifth Avenue and you basically had all the floats in an airport parking lot, like where they put the planes and everything, what would that look like? And I don't know. So it's just pulling, and then it just came to me. I can't explain like how, but I just like, there it was. And then I went back, and then I was like starting to incorporate other elements in, which, had kind of a speculative kind of element to them, so even in some of the earlier pages. So it really is something like, this book's been rewritten and picked apart and put back together a million times, even though it looks like, oh, you just sit down and write the whole thing.
There's this through line of shape shifting throughout. And I'm glad you brought that up, because it's Baba Yaga. It's even the boss, the real estate boss. Is he good? Is he bad? What is he doing? Why is he appearing, disappearing? Even the romantic, connection is not what it seems, and people are not what they seem. But there's shape shifting for good or for bad. So it's definitely that ambiguity that you mentioned, but it's really interesting that it's a theme throughout, a through line, if you will. Did you consciously make a decision on that, or did it just evolve as you wrote?
It more or less evolved, and I read a lot, and in many different genres, including nonfiction. And Joseph Campbell was a big influence. I read his work while I was writing the novel. It encouraged me to go further with some of what I was thinking. And Joseph Campbell talks about the origins of myths and myths in society, and that had a really big influence, because he talks about archetypes. That in life and society and in movies, fiction, that you have, let's say, the Joker, you have the leader, you have the quest, the person who's on the quest. And when he was talking about these different archetypes that build in not only societies, but in a lot of writing, it got me thinking, well, who is this? Who represents that? And what are they doing? What do they want? And I never outlined this book. I didn't write down, well, this person is this and that, but it just like, it's in the back of my mind. And I started to identify some of these people as being exactly that. I'm going, yeah, this person's in my book. Yeah, I've got that, but I can bring that a little further, and so that was one of the influences.
And did you consciously try to focus on like transformations for the characters? Or again, was that something that was organic? Like Tina definitely changes from her experience at the end of the book.
Because I thought, as I was getting into it, her language changes a little bit. She still has that Jersey girl language, but it becomes more sophisticated from the first chapter to, let's say, 2/3 of the way in the book. She's taking agency of her own self. She's really like her inner smart person She's always smart. She's not stupid, but she's very insecure. So I think along with her becoming stronger, physically stronger, she's becoming mentally stronger and more intellectually on a higher level. And I tried to make that, it couldn't be a sudden change. So that was tricky, like trying to make that gradual change as it went through. And that's part of the rewriting process. So, and the other characters I thought about, and how does Big Steve change? What happens to him at the end? Like, they can't just stay the same. I mean, Jay Fox is more or less, he's the minor character. He doesn't have to change, but how do they evolve? How does this Bulgarian manual change not just their lives, but their selves, their inner workings? And so, because I think that's more interesting than just having a plot like this happens, and that's the end. There's a organic kind of shift.
Yeah, there's so much I want to talk about. So, like the Bulgarian Training Manual is sort of like the objective correlative there. It's like where everybody's emotions and hopes and dreams are pinned on this object that's like kind of doing its own shape shifting. It's in one person's hands, and another person's hands, in another country, and it's all these surprises. But what struck me about the book, and now I read a lot of books, not only for my work as an editor, but as for the podcast, I feel that a lot of work is careful, like careful in terms of I don't feel freedom. And from your book, I felt two things. Not only a sense of freedom that in the wrong hands could be chaotic, but the craft was there. So it's the freedom of the writing and the expression and the way that the story takes you almost on like waves of like if you're surfing in an ocean. And also the craft, there is a narrative arc. There is transformation. There is an element of suspense. There is a lot of research imbued into the book in terms of the historical and biblical and even societal and country references, the government of socialist country. So can you talk a little bit about the research aspect? Because I think that really adds an underlying layer of gravitas to this very freewheeling, like you said, Barbie. I think, did you say Barbie on acid or Chiclet on acid?
Yes, yes.
Yes.
Well, yeah, I can because first of all, I wanted to make sure that everything, no matter how outlandish, no matter how funny or how impossible, isn't untrue. And they're two different things. Like something could be like really out there, but it has to have a basis of truth. And the novelist Ursula Heggie, who writes completely different kinds of books, once said to me, we were talking about books, and she was describing a scene just real quick, which it involved a fire, and it was supposed to be a very minor scene. It ends up becoming a huge scene because she actually spoke to firefighters and asked them, well, if this happened and this went on fire, would it spread across the room or what? And they gave her this whole big rundown. And suddenly she realized that she had to have that right. Because if you are reading it, even if it's like a fantasy, which hers is reality, but you go, oh, no, that there's no way, because the laws of physics are such that this couldn't happen. So there's a lot of things where, you want it to be true and fantastical at the same time. So I did a lot of research, and also I followed my kind of whimsy. I followed my interest through it because I'd start reading something and go down that rabbit hole. And it's like, well, how can I bring that rabbit hole into the book without like sending it off in a different direction? So some of the historic characters are there. Like some of the religion part, I went to Catholic school. I went to an all girls Catholic school taught by nuns. So, and we always made fun of the nuns all the time. And so it sort of evolves when I was thinking of a fad diet, like what could be the latest fad diet? Like no matter, because there's so many wild ones out there. And then I was like reading, I came across quite by accident, some mention of St. Catherine of Siena, which I actually saw. I was on a trip. I was in a church. There was an interesting statue. I was like, oh, so I'm reading the plaque, and it said she lived on communion wafers for 7 years. I'm like, okay, the St. Catherine diet, we got it. And so it's just like, I just found that to be like weird and funny. So it's like, we'll incorporate that, So, and then I had to start researching it because I couldn't just say that. It's like, I don't know anything about this saint. So I started reading, and, that's why it takes a long time. So every single element in there that seems kind of weird or wild, or even like anabolic steroids I talk about. Well, I read about anabolic steroids, who invented them. There's a section that talks about a KGB guy talking to an American Olympic trainer and the people at the gym, like sharing information. Well, that's not that far from the truth, because I don't have my notes here, but the person who kind of invented the form of steroids that are used by athletes, he was the Olympic doctor to the US Olympic team, and he got some of that information from like a Russian or a Romanian or something like that. And they were just like, just like talking. I don't know if they were at the gym or a happy hour or what, but it was totally just, they were buddies. And I go, oh, I got to try that. And he actually gave it to people in the Olympic team because at that point it wasn't a banned substance because nobody even knew about it. So I'm like reading, I'm like, this is ridiculous, you know? And it's so sometimes like life and fiction are not that far apart.
That's so interesting how you did the research. How long did it take you to write the book? How many years?
Probably like close to 10 years. From
Wow.
the very, very first couple of pages and talking to Meg Wallitzer, and she said, take it further. Well, you know, I could have just banged out like something funny, but as I got into it, into these rabbit holes, so to speak, you know, I would stop and I'd think about it and I'd write something new. And it's like, well, how does that fit into the whole? And then start rewriting, you know, so on and off. And I didn't write it every single day. Like people talk about, well, they stop, they write every day. I didn't write every day. I put it away for like 3 months and then take it out, you know, so in between though, I'm always thinking about it. So even if I'm not writing, it lives in my head, or I'll notice something and I'll be, I could use that.
How does it feel to finally have it out in the world after all those years?
It's great. I mean, I just can't tell you how great, because also when it was ready, when it was finished and I'm sending it off, I'm thinking, oh my God, is people going to think this is crazy, this book, you know? And then finally, not only does it get published by a traditional publisher, it also got great reviews, because that was the other kind of thing, like, oh my God, I don't want to look, you know, when a review would come in, I'm like, my God, they liked it, you know, and I shouldn't be surprised because I like it, but it's like people like their own work, but what do other people think about it? So when I started getting all these great reviews, if nothing else, if it goes no further, it's like, yep, is good.
You sound just like Tina here.
Yeah. Well, there's a little bit of Tina in me. Let's put it that way.
Sure. I think there's a little bit in all of us. So how did you find your publisher, Clash Books?
Well, I was kind of lucky in a way, because I had just started sending it out to agents, and Kaylee Jones, who is a writer. She's the daughter of James Jones, who wrote From Here to Eternity, and she's been steeped in the literary world all her life. And she teaches not only at Stony Brook, but at Wilkes University in their MFA program. And you know, so I've known her over the years. And she read it. She read it for me. And then she said to me, she goes, you know, and she's also an editor at Akashic Books. I was thinking of submitting it there. And she said, there's this publisher, Clash, and I know these guys, and I think they will love this. I think it's perfect. And I really think that would be good. So, well, okay, I sent it off to them. And about a month later, I got a phone call, and sure enough, you know, they read it, because she said, mention my name. So I did. So they brought it up from the slush pile, and you know.
I love that. I love that story.
Yeah.
So we're almost out of time, but what's next for you, Ruth?
Well, I've got a couple of ideas, some books that I put on hold, 2 novels, and I've also been writing memoir essays, which are totally different than my fiction. And so I may just keep those to essays and not do a whole memoir. But I think I've got one book that probably is about 2/3 of the way finished, but I just put that aside because I was focusing on the Bulgarian Training Manual and everything else that came with it. So I think I'm going to go back to it and see where that leads me.
Well, this has been such a pleasure, and I know we'll talk offline, but I'm so glad that we're connected, and I'm so happy to share this with my listeners and viewers, and I'll put all the information in the show notes where people can follow you and get your book. And thank you so much for being on the program.
Thank you. I mean, I thank you. This was a really, really nice of you, and it was a lot of fun too. Thanks so much.
Follow me at EstelleSErasmus.com on my website, and on social media, which is Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter, at Estelle S. Erasmus. And we're now on YouTube for Freelance Writing Direct. Follow along, and soon everyone will be reading what you're writing.